All right. So before moving further into the Laravel framework, there are few things that every framework requires to must have the basic knowledge. Every person must have the basic knowledge of any framework he or she is learning. So in order to learn the Laravel framework, we must have to know like what is the life cycle of the Laravel. So this episode will going to be a completely theoretical base. So if you don't want to know or you just already know, you can skip this one and move to the next part. But I would recommend like this is the really important thing and this is really important interview question as well. All right, so you must have to know that what is the life cycle of Laravel, what happens when a request comes, and what are the processes are running behind the scenes which we don't know. So we should know and we should be aware of that. So the first step, let's take to the first step. So whenever the endpoint is hit, so it automatically goes to the public forward slash index.php. All right, so let's open the public folder here and then the index.php. All right, so what we see here is basically this defines the Laravel start time, what is the time, at what time the request came, and then it loads the maintenance, checks if the maintenance is there, and then it auto loads the file. All right, so what it does, it is doing is basically it is like all the requests are pointing towards index.php and that file doesn't contain much code, and here you can see like this doesn't contains much code. Instead it is like loading the files, including the files, checking the files if exist, and then loading the instance. All right, so what is here, what is the instance? All right, so rather it is a starting point for loading the rest of the framework. All right, the index.php file loads the composer generated autoloader definition. All right, so the composer creates the autoloader definition, it loads that composer definition, and then it creates an instance of the Laravel framework from bootstrap forward slash app.php. All right, so let's open that file here as well, bootstrap and app.php. Now here you can see that what it is doing, it is doing a little bit of magic here, and it is returning the application at the end. You can see like we have singleton methods here, we have singleton bindings and stuff like that, and it is creating an instance of the application, and then it is returning the application. All right, the next thing is basically http console kernels. All right, so what it is, it checks like the request is coming from where either it is an http request or it is a console request. So http request means like I enter the URL in the browser, and that is basically the http request. The console request is basically the command line request. So it checks that, and it checks like where this action should be triggered or where this action should go. All right, so if it is http request, then it will go to the middlewares, it will check the middlewares, it will check the CSRF tokens, http sessions, cookies and stuff like that, and it will return us the response. All right, so if it is console command, then it will check the commands and it will trigger those commands. So we will learn like what the console commands are, but that's really far away from in this course right now. Then the service providers. So the main purpose of service providers, so service providers are really the main important thing of the Laravel framework. So what they does is basically they provide the services, either these are for databases, these are for queues, routings, validations, caching and stuff like that. So these provides the services to the Laravel application. They loads these providers, and from where they load these providers, so it loads from the config forward slash app.php. Let's take a look at here. So I am just explaining you an overview of how the request life cycle works. We just don't need to go deeper yet right now. So if you go to the app.php, down below we will see the array of the providers. There we go. So now you can see like it is loading the app service provider, auth service provider, event service provider, route service provider, and we can load more service providers later in the application which we require or which we create by ourselves. All right. So this is basically the service provider's main purpose is to boot the application and then gives the services to the application, either it is database and stuff like that. All right. Now the next point is the routing. So routes are basically the important things. Every application has routes. For example, if you take a look at laravel.com /docs, so /docs itself is a route. All right. So there are few things, certain things in this here which are dynamic, but /docs is a route, and lifecycle itself is a route. So then the next part is basically it checks the routes files. It loads the route service provider, it checks if there is any middleware applied on the routing, and then it eventually checks like what action do I have to take on a certain route. So let's open the routes file first. So inside the routes we have different kind of files. um, we have the API, we have channels, we have console, and we have web. Right now we are going to deal with the web because web is used for HTTP routes. Any endpoint that is opened in the browser in the URL here, that will automatically go to the HTTP request. All right, so to the web routes. So what is it is doing here is like it is saying like if this endpoint hits, I should return the welcome view. All right, so we can obviously echo anything here, and we can create more endpoints by saying like okay, so if this endpoint hits, for example xyz hits, I should say like echo xyz and stuff like that. And obviously there are a lot of advanced things in the routing here, but the main purpose of telling you is basically so every http request comes to this web.php, and every API request, we have a different API.php here. If we are going to create the APIs, we need to define those APIs in this API.php here. Then we have the console here. So if we are going to um, uh, create a console commands, give the application like what you need to do when a certain action is taken, what command you need to run, then we do these console.php here. So this is basically the routing is. And once this route, if check if that route exists, so it will return the route, it will point to the controller and then the controller function, and then controller will do the processes whatever we ask the controller to do, and it will eventually return us the response. And the response can be in the form of JSON, in the form of string, or in the form of view. All right, so now this is basically the four steps of the request lifecycle. The first step is basically it loads the instance, it goes to the HTTP, it loads the service providers, and then it loads the routing. All right, so that's about it for this request lifecycle. And I would recommend you to please read this once before you move forward into the framework. All right, so that's about it, and I will see you in the next one.